Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on July 20th, 2017, and this is episode 44. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticoastPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicoast.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. On this week's show, we're going to discuss the BC NDP's first moves as a new government, and we have a special interview with UBC economist Tom Davidoff. But first, we have a couple corrections from last week when we were sitting down with Ryan. We mentioned RJ Aquino's name. He was never part of Vision as far as we could tell. He was part of COPE, the left-wing municipal political party. And I think Ryan accidentally lumped Rob Fleming, MLA, in with the NDP group that tried to oust Carol James, and he was not part of that. So apologies for any mistakes. Call us out and we'll correct them. First up, cabinet construction. John Horgan was sworn in as Premier on Tuesday, and we got a look at who's in cabinet. None of the names are that surprising based on our discussion last week. A lot of them to me look like the sort of old school sort of stalwarts of the NDP, the people who've been around the longest. You have Carol James in Deputy Premier and Finance, Adrian Dix, Rob Fleming, David Eby. Well, he's newer, but he got the Attorney General position, which I know a lot of people are very happy about, myself included. Mike Farnworth is in there, Harry Baines, George Heyman. Almost the people who've been in the NDP for the longest got the most important roles.
Before this, there was some question on whether or not the new John Horgan administration would kind of go towards kind of a newer direction or kind of keep the old guard around quite as much. And I guess this answers that question. In terms of the actual pitch, there weren't a huge amount of surprises. Most of the people we mentioned last week ended up getting cabinet pitched, and a lot of them were more or less what we were expecting.
It's also a pretty big cabinet, so I think between the sort of 22 names in the main cabinet and 6 people in the parliamentary secretaries, most MLAs in the New Democrat caucus got something. There are some who didn't. But I think what it also shows with that experience at the senior level is he probably wants to be very ambitious and push through as much as he can, probably because he knows it might not be a long-lived government and it's better to try really hard while you can, sort of maybe a Dave Barrett style where you pass a record number of legislation, although he'll have some difficulty with that. So maybe pass a record number of orders in council.
Yeah, and having some experience on the bench definitely helps where he tries to navigate the somewhat tricky legislative process. So I think that's a definite win.
I think in terms of the specific names, compared to what we talked about, Melanie Mark was given advanced education, which I think we were all thinking she'd be a bit more into the health or poverty reduction based on her history. I still think it's probably going to be a good position for her. A lot of people talked her up very positively, but it's kind of just not directly connected with her experience, but sometimes that can be an advantage. Meanwhile, Bowen Ma got TransLink, which is not quite the infrastructure level people were expecting, but I think her experience being an engineer here in Metro Van will be very positive in that role. There were actually a couple surprising names left off the list. Nicholas Simons, the MLA and former leadership contender from Sunshine Coast, didn't get a position, and neither did Spencer Chandra Herbert, who's actually a very popular MLA from the West End here in Vancouver. Perhaps neither of them wanted anything, or like a lot of people said, you can't give everyone something, especially when you want to get the gender balanced cabinet, which he managed to do here. We have 11 women and 11 men, but I think a lot of people were talking up both of them as possible picks for something, and it's sort of unfortunate not to see those talented people be put to use in front benches.
Yeah, we also talked last week about who from kind of the north and the interior would get various portfolios, and Doug Donaldson, whose name we mentioned, who's from northern BC, got forest lands, natural resource operations, and rural development, which probably would fit. Interestingly, environment went to someone from the city here, George Heyman.
Although a lot of people pegged Heyman for that position based on his experience with the Sierra Club and sort of his history of environmental activism. The other MLA from the north, Jennifer Rice, got the Emergency Preparedness Parliamentary Secretary, so I think the NDP was definitely thinking about making sure they had people from all over the province in cabinet. Lana Popham, who I think is from the Fraser Valley, is in agriculture. And I think Ryan mentioned her as the obvious pick for it. So some of the obvious people got the obvious jobs, I guess.
Yeah, another one that got a bit of attention was Selena Robinson in municipal affairs and housing. And with housing as one of the big issues in BC, that'll be a portfolio to watch.
And I think people were hoping David Eby would be in there, but with his sort of legal expertise, he's going to do well in the Attorney General role, but he can still talk with Robinson and the rest of caucus and share those ideas. I don't think those were like his unique ideas for the NDP. He was just sort of a good voice for them. And so hopefully Selena can pick up some of those from David and they can all be good friends and share what works.
Yeah, she's a former Coquitlam city councillor and so is from the metro area. And that was one of those things that everyone was watching for. And it was basically a no-brainer that it was going to be someone local.
One of the interesting things that I've seen come out of the BC Liberal caucus in criticizing this, besides just trying to paint each of them off as far left extremists like the Rebel media has done, is I've seen a number attack the new mental health and addictions cabinet member, which is held by Judy Darcy, specifically asking why should it be a separate portfolio from health, and which is Adrian Dix's portfolio, because then you have two ministries sort of operating in the same area and competing against each other, when sometimes if you'd put one under the other, there could be a lot more sharing of resources and strategy. I think with the sort of depth of the crisis and the fact it was both a Green and NDP commitment to create this ministry, they weren't going to go back on that. And I'm not sure that this structure precludes working together. The Trudeau Liberal government, when he announced his cabinet, he gave everyone a full ministry, even ministries that used to be under others, as sort of parliamentary secretaries and other. And it, for any of the flaws of the Trudeau government, no one's really complained that the ministries aren't working together. So I think there is a possibility for this to go forward.
Yeah, although a lot of those, it wasn't so much they were establishing a giant, huge bureaucracy. It was more they were changing someone's title, giving them a few extra staff and a pay boost.
And in this case, having that focus on mental health and addictions, given the crisis we have right now, feels pretty justified. And I don't see that line of attack resonating with the public very much. No one's going to go, oh, you're doing too much on the health crisis by creating an extra ministry for it.
Yeah, it's really kind of just sniping at whatever little kind of implementation flaw in it is. And those things rarely get much traction.
One of the more perhaps justified complaints is the Liberal Party actually filed a written complaint to the acting Comptroller General Carl Fisher on Monday because one of the staff appointments to the government rather than the sort of party was this Confidence and Supply Agreement Secretariat, which would sort of work for John Horgan to smooth out the differences between the NDP and the Greens to make sure Parliament worked effectively, which comes off as a very partisan, let's get the government working, not necessarily the opposition. And I could see why people don't like that.
Yeah, I think there's a valid complaint in there that sort of party-to-party interface is really something that should be a party resource thing, not a government resource.
I think I saw one of the NDP defenses saying the Liberals could access this secretariat as well to try to work with the government on things. And I think if it had a better name than Confidence and Supply Agreement Secretariat, like call it the friggin' Making Parliament Work Secretariat or something, or the,
The branding's only slightly worse than the Green Office of the Green DP.
Even then, it still probably wouldn't be that nonpartisan because we don't generally have in an adversarial system consensus building office. Maybe if we're radically changing our parliament and electoral reform could do that, it would be a valuable tool to have a sort of arbitrator to help all the parties in a minority government work together. It's still something that was a self-inflicted wound very on. I mean, David Moscrop called it a dumb mistake. It was pretty easy to just go, let's not create this office, not tell anyone what it costs yet. I think those numbers will come out later once they've secured all the contracts. but money going to this sort of quasi-partisan purpose is a bit questionable.
And the other big thing on John Horgan's plate this week was the fires. He skipped the Council of the Federation.
It was a premier's meeting.
Yeah,
I don't remember if
it's the First Minister's annual meeting, the Council of the Federation, to stay here and deal with the fire situation. He's made additional resources available, extended the state of emergency for 2 weeks, and $600 is going to be available to every evacuee household for every 14-day period they're forced out of their homes. And this seems like a fairly obvious political win as far as the people are thinking about politics in this situation. Is not only does he not have to go into the First Minister's meeting just learning everything there is to know about kind of the state of the BC stuff that, the Liberals may not have been public with. He gets to stay here and be, the guy helping out with the fire, and giving resources to disaster victims is never a bad thing.
Yeah, the other thing he announced just today was an extra $100 increase to the welfare rates for people with disabilities and people on income assistance, which will take place in 60 days, sort of the fastest they can roll it out based on whatever rules are behind it. And this idea of give money to people forced out of their homes for fires, give money to people with disabilities, give money to the poor, no one's really against it. Even the Liberals had sort of come around to it in the fake throne speech they gave that cribbed everything from the other parties. But the fire thing's particularly uncontroversial, as last week we saw John Horgan and Christy Clark appearing almost together in Kelowna in this weird interim period where we had two premiers, and there was no politicking. It was just, let's be there to see what the damages are and see what we can do. And I get the sense that even if Christy Clark was still in for another couple weeks, this might have still come through, or else they would have been working on it together. So good move. It's the least we can do. Hopefully we can solve climate change and never have another forest fire, but I don't think we'll ever get there. So mitigating the damages is the best we can do for now.
Just one interesting thing that I saw is actually the number of fires are down from last year, but their locations are much, much worse.
Well, here in BC, right? Last year we had the big Fort McMurray fires.
Yes.
So I guess it's just which area.
Yeah, we're actually down, I think, somewhere between 50 to 100 fires compared to this time last year.
They've just all combined together to mega fires.
Yes, and they're just all around places where people live rather than out in the boonies.
We're sitting down this afternoon in Vanier Park, just behind the observatory, I guess. Nice little summer day, to talk with Professor Tom Davidoff about housing and...
Great to be with you. It's a lovely afternoon.
Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
So maybe you could start off by just telling us a bit about what it is you do at UBC and what your sort of main focus is there.
Yeah, I am an economist. I got to UBC in 2009. There's always been a great real estate and urban economics concentration of economists within the Sauder School of Business. So I was happy to come here then, and I've been doing urban and housing economics. My main areas have been the impact of housing regulations on prices, largely in the States, and reverse mortgage has been an area I've been very interested in. With an aging society, we have a lot of people, and Vancouver's a classic example, with not great incomes, but a huge amount of housing wealth. It makes sense if you want to stay in the house to consume some of the home equity, but lending to seniors is a tricky market and contractually hard to make work. So I spent a lot of time studying that. But, when you live in Vancouver, it's hard to escape Vancouver real estate as a topic. And as soon as I arrived, the thing that became so clear to me was we had a crazy mix of income versus property tax and sales tax. So it was a few years ago with a grad school classmate, Saku Aura, who's now at Missouri, we did a paper showing, not too surprisingly, property taxes are a mix of, a classical land value tax, which people like because, the land can't go anywhere, and you want to tax things that can't run away from the tax. If you tax something that runs away from the tax, you screw up the economy and you don't make any money. It's a total lose. So property taxes are a mix of a land value tax and a tax on development and structures. So in places where a lot of the value in real estate is in land and not so much in the structure, you should have higher property taxes and lower income and sales taxes. Now, I was in California, which is famous for Prop 13, and so you start at about 1.25% on your property tax, it gets lower because it's fixed nominally, and people think, boy, that's, it's the property tax burden is just too low in California. Then I got to North Vancouver, opened up my property tax bill, and I thought it was for the month. I mean, I put $5,000 for the year, maybe even less. I mean, what a crazy rate, and it's just gone down from there. I think we're at 30 basis points, 0.3% now in Vancouver, and of course, income and sales taxes here are hefty. So that has always struck me as crazy. And when the affordability stuff started to really kick in around 2016, I and some colleagues got to thinking, we should say something about this. And there seemed to be this issue of outside money coming in, some from China, obviously, but generally people coming here to buy property or not coming here to buy property, not really to live in necessarily, but maybe a vacation home, maybe a spec purchase. It just seemed like that was an issue, the homes that are empty a lot of the year. And it just became obvious, okay, so there's a way to fix this, which is fix the tax system. And that would be raise property taxes, cut income taxes. That's the right move. But, you can't tell a politician, hey, you should really raise taxes in a way that's going to punish people in their 50s and 60s and reward renters, because that's, probably the best possible way to lose an election. So that was really the impetus. Soar Somerville, Sang Hoon Lee, and I agreed on something like the BC Housing Affordability Fund. We told the premier, we wrote her a letter and said, you ought to raise property taxes, but give a lot of exemptions. If you pay income tax, every dollar of income tax you pay as a credit. If you've been in the house a long time, you're totally exempt. If you're a retiree, you're totally exempt. So really, it would just be people who have recently bought a really expensive home but don't make a living in Vancouver and aren't landlords who would pay the tax. And we thought it was a good idea. The government sat on it for a while. I saw an article by Kathy Tomlinson in the Globe and Mail. She's terrific. I apologize for butchering her first name. And she quoted David Eby at length about the empty homes issue. So I decided I'd send David Eby an email, with a sketch of our idea. And I expected, thank you, crazy constituent, whatever, have a nice day, which is essentially what we had gotten from the Premier's office. But David was kind enough to say, let's talk about this. I went to his office. We chatted for a while. I said, I think we could make this a piece of legislation. So we spent a lot of work. I got, I think, 50 economists from UBC and SFU to agree on a particular set of proposals. Getting 50 economists to agree on anything is challenging, which I think is just an indication it's such a flamingly obvious idea to make things better. And then, it just got a lot of attention. I think it was the right idea at the right time. There was a lot of media, and I've spent a lot of the last 2 years just hanging out trying to pitch people on A, tax reform, and B, the other obvious piece, which is zoning, because, I live on the west side of Vancouver, and you see places, $3 million home. What is the point of single-family homes that are going to cost $3 million? What are you preserving? Especially when you look at what gets built. It's not usually. I live in a lot of it, but I wouldn't call it, straight out of Architectural Digest what's getting built. So, two obvious pieces of low-hanging fruit to help affordability. Both, a bit of a tough lift politically, and that's been my last couple of years.
Right. So the specific proposals around increase in tax, you're looking at going up to 2% with the
combined. We said 1.5% augmentation. So the BC Housing Affordability Fund, which I'll say we called a fund because everybody likes a fund better than a tax. You give the proceeds to people. We said lump sum, just write everybody a check. But you can think about building affordable housing with the money. You can give the money only to renters. There's lots you could do. But we said just write everybody a check. Where's the money come from? 1.5% property tax surcharge on everybody. But as I say, you're exempt. I think if you're a veteran, if you're a retiree, if you've lived in the house more than 5 or 10 years, some number to be determined. And then you get credits. Every dollar of income tax you pay is $1 of credit against this amount. And, if you've bought a house recently and you're making a living here, you ought to be paying that much tax. And then we said gross receipts from a landlord. I'd love to make it taxable income from a landlord, but with mortgage debt, depreciation, and property taxes, you'd probably have zero net income as a landlord in Vancouver. But if you say gross rental income, that's another way that you've declared to CRA. That's another way out. And the nice thing about this, I think, is you can't fake it because it's so easy to prove. Here's my check I wrote to CRA. Here's my tax return. So the audit's a piece of cake. It's information that the buyer has, but the provincial government may not have. So we thought there was some elegance in that. That's the proposal. I don't know what rate, if any, the NDP will go with. Maybe they'll phase it in. Maybe they'll go high and then ease back later. But our suggestion was 1.5%, because the total then would go to about 2% in Metro Vancouver, which would be on the high end of not crazy for North America, which is, we think, at least where Vancouver ought to be.
How do you see this affecting that foreign money effect you alluded to? So
I have to be modest here and say I don't know, because I don't have there's just not a lot of experiments. So suppose you're foreign, or maybe a rich guy from Toronto who has a place, a pied-à-terre in Vancouver, because that isn't your primary residence, I should mention it. It doesn't matter what country you're from. If you're not using that as your address for tax purposes, you wouldn't get the credit. So you'd owe the 1.5%. And what do? You could pay it. That's great. That's a lot of money. I mean, I get a lot of abuse these days on Twitter for saying, if people pay enough tax to leave a place largely empty, use it as a vacation home, store box for dirty cash. I mean, 1.5% of $1 million, that'll pay almost somebody's rent for a year. So, it's fine if they pay that. That's one response. The other response is they sell to a local. That's great. The other response is they rent to a local, which is great. So either you get cash, or you get more housing. It's a Pigouvian tax, which is nice. When you tax something you don't like, there's no losing, because either you get money or you get not the activity you don't like, which in this case is owning real estate in Vancouver but not making a living here.
Would there be any difficulties with enforcement in collecting those taxes?
See, I don't, of course, right? I mean, okay. But it would involve faking your income tax return. You could have a fake lease and declare fake income to CRA, but I think that just gets pretty risky. Right. And you sign over your place to somebody in a lease who then actually does have the right. He could say I'm not going to use it, but there was one of these guys got murdered, I think, in West Vancouver over a debate about, somebody had a fraudulent title to the house, and then there was a debate about who really got to own the house. So faking is hard. Again, I think CRA and the city, the Canada Revenue Agency, is pretty bad about data sharing. I think there's something they think has to do, and maybe they're right, with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I think that needs to be revisited, because I think it's very clear with stuff like the empty homes tax, which Vancouver does, which I think is pretty akin to what we're doing. It's not the same, but it's similar. It would be very helpful if the city of Vancouver could tell the feds, hey, this guy says this is his primary residence. If he declares another primary residence to avoid a capital gains tax, say, you ought to whack him. So I think data sharing would be great, and I hope the new government in BC will push on that.
Right, I'm sure they'd like it too, because it also would be a disincentive to kind of hide the rental income too, if they now have to claim the receipt.
Well, that's right. Now, there might be a lot fewer basement suites if people have to start declaring the taxable income. I don't know.
You mentioned the other focus you've been looking at is zoning and policy. Maybe you could touch in a bit. What's wrong with zoning?
Well, sure. I mean, nothing's wrong with zoning,
or as it's done in Vancouver.
Sure. And let me take a step back and say I've written the work I've done on regulations and housing prices is very skeptical, because the thing is, as a matter of science, you don't get zoning regulations that are very intense in places where nobody wants to live and where there's not beautiful amenities. You get intense regulations where there's a lot of rich lawyers who are clever enough to figure out to regulate, and where there's mountains and oceans, which are worth protecting.
And like most public policy, they don't tend to do it in randomized control trials.
That's exactly my point. It is legislative endogeneity, right? So the legislation comes from stuff on the ground. So if you're like, oh my God, San Francisco is more expensive and has higher price growth than Topeka, Kansas, it must be the regulations. Believe it or not, that was the state of economic play, I would like to say, before I started doing some research in the field. So, with that caveat that it's hard to prove anything, the west side of Vancouver, land costs something like $50 million an acre, even at moderate zoning. So you can't have a single-family home that's affordable. And single-family homes in Vancouver, I've looked at this along with my wife, Dulcie Anderson. I think maybe the last time we looked, maybe 5% of homes on the west side of Vancouver are affordable to 5% of the income distribution of married couples who are richer than other people in Vancouver. So single-family home is not workforce housing in Vancouver. So why would you take the majority of land in Vancouver and make it single-family? And if you go to West Van or North Vancouver, obviously the land's a little cheaper. It's not as conveniently located, but it's fantastic land. And so much of it is zoned single family, which is just going forward not an appropriate use. I think people in their 20s and 30s, if you ask them what they hope to live in, I think they would be very happy if they wind up owning a 1,500 square foot duplex or townhome. They're not going to be able to afford a 2,500 square foot house with a yard in a decent commute close to Vancouver. They know it. And so when you force single-family housing, it's an offense to free market principles because the market wants to build so very much more. It's bad for the environment because when you squish housing down from the density it wants to be at, it has to go somewhere, and it goes to places where people have to cut down trees to build homes, and then they have to drive instead of taking transit on a long commute. So a violation of the free market, bad for the environment, and it has bad distributive consequences because you're taking money from homeowners. Because the homeowners, they like it because they want their neighborhood to be the way it is. But when they want to sell, obviously you can sell more to an apartment developer than somebody who's going to buy a single-family home. So the homeowner loses money. Renters are screwed because they're not going to be able to find a place to live. So who's the winner? Answer, people who bring money from outside Vancouver to buy single-family homes, because believe it or not, single-family homes are hugely subsidized in Vancouver. There's way more of them than there should be. There should be almost none, just like there aren't in Manhattan and other places with prices like Vancouver. Instead, they're a huge fraction of the, certainly land stock in Vancouver. So you're handing a gift to rich people from elsewhere. We know it's not locals who can afford to have single-family homes. So that is a truly rare trifecta: bad for the environment, bad for the market, and bad distribution. So it's bad.
So you're making a compelling case on why people shouldn't like the zoning, but it's also very hard to change it around here.
Yeah.
And anyone who's ever gone to any of the council meetings know that everyone comes out to oppose, or a lot of people come out to oppose any changes to it. Why do you think it is so hard politically to make changes here, especially if the people who benefit from the most don't vote here?
Well, right. So renters don't vote, generally speaking. Homeowners do. So that's one. And then, nobody who wants their neighborhood to change. Now, you might say, well, you should want your neighborhood to change because you'll get upzoned and you'll get rich. But a couple of things. One, why don't you wait till you move to get rich? Maybe people don't know. The other thing is what gets put on the table. I think, possibly because of the community amenity contribution structure, a lot of cities would rather upzone a few parcels to apartment than do bulk rezonings. Because when you do a few parcels, you get to have huge community amenity contributions. That is, you charge the developer for the right to upzone. And you're annoying, a finite number of neighbors. But the upside is, you want to get more affordable housing, and you get a lot of it built, right? If you'd have almost the same fight to make a single house in Dunbar be a duplex as you would to build a tower in Chinatown, and you'd get, hundreds fewer units. So I think that's part of it. Now, I will say, though, greed plays a role. When you include people in, like in the Canby corridor, my understanding is everybody wants to be inside the rezoned area, not outside. So I think there's a lot of support among homeowners because they see I get rich when I get upzoned. So I certainly think you want to cut people in and let them see the benefits. So I'd say a combination of people love the status quo and it takes a little bit of creativity to get to win-win.
I was going to ask, what do you think it's been done well anywhere? And you already answered that with the
I think Canby corridor is pretty good. I think Vision's trying. I talk to them a lot, and I think they're doing their best, and they recognize political constraints, but also want to do the right thing and get housing built. I think they've been too slow on the west side, and I think the councilors, and anybody who hasn't pushed in their time on council to rezone at least to duplex, Right? I mean, any single-family home, at least be able to add a door where you want to add a door on the west side. It's not too much to ask. To say it would change the character is ridiculous, because the character is going to change anyway. All these little salt box houses or whatever are going to be pimped-out luxury mansions with marble. And that's the market, by the way, saying, please, let me add capital. When land is really valuable, you want to pour a lot of capital on the land. So you see these houses, and you're like, oh my God, that's so over the top. But the market is begging to put in capital. Now, they want to build big buildings, but if you can't build a big building, you make a very, very fancy, moderate-sized building.
Yeah, I used to live in Arbutus Ridge, and that was
Oh, my
very
God.
common around there, is to knock down the old buildings and put up some giant...
Yeah, so Arbutus
mansion.
Ridge is like...
16th and-
yeah,
just
20th
south of
and that sort
16th.
Yeah,
right below Kiss.
exactly. Yeah, so I never know what to call it. So Kilchina, Arbutus Ridge. So, I walked through that neighborhood. I lived on 8th and McDonald, near there. And I was walking to go over to or biking maybe to the, where you get your driver's license done on McDonald and something. So I went through that neighborhood, and I was, I never saw this neighborhood before. Why? Because I had no reason to be there. There's nothing there. There's no stores, nothing. It's a bunch of houses that sit empty. Maybe they sit empty, maybe they don't. But come on, single-family housing there is just crazy. Now, I've heard the soil isn't great. You can't build that big, but at least townhouse.
Yeah, and even the soil, that's definitely a manageable problem.
Yeah.
Well, at
you're
least the lot
engineer.
sizes are half or a third of Shaughnessy, where
Even worse.
you just
Even
kind of
worse, yeah.
take minutes to walk between these mansions.
If it's an
have a
architectural
sort of-
classic, it's okay. But if you're going to pimp it out to something new, no excuse.
So besides just a broad rezoning, is there any specific zoning changes you'd like to see?
I have a degree in city planning, but I'm not a, physical planner. I actually am more sympathetic than a lot of economists to limitations. I understand you don't want 50 stories tall everywhere. It would make the light bad. This is a nice place. I think preservation definitely has value. I grew up in Park Slope, Brooklyn, where there's these limestone or brownstone 3 or 4 story townhouses, but wall to wall. If you require a lot of street trees, you can do that, very nice. I think that should be about the west side of Vancouver. Also, in Kitts, if you go uphill from where we're sitting, there's a lot of 3 and 4 story old rental buildings with names, the Flamingo, the, Moroccan Court, whatever. I think those are, they're not high quality, but they're not fancy, but they're fine. I think that level, low to moderate density, wall to wall, single family, multifamily, that sort of thing, I think would be totally appropriate and really nice on the west side.
And maybe cleaning up some of the random other restrictions or requirements like parking.
Well, parking's, I'm a bit of an environmental nut, so don't get me started on cars. I think, increasing transit and reducing parking requirements would be terrific. Oh, here's one. So I just recently moved to this neighborhood where, parking's impossible on the weekend, right? So I got a parking permit, which says I can park in Kitts Point anytime I want, whenever I want for a year. So if there was a free market, that would cost $2,000-$3,000 probably easy. Instead, I think I paid $40. I mean, that is crazy. That is I don't think people know. I mean, so if there's how many people own a home in Vancouver in this city? A couple 100K, right? How many homeowners? I don't know. I should know the number of housing. Suppose it's 100,000 people who are given this gift. It's probably more. 100,000 times a $2,000, well, maybe $1,000 subsidy apiece. It's a lot of money that the city gives away every year to encourage people to have more car than they ought to.
And it's understandable to have a car if you're out in Surrey and commuting in, but with the advent of ride sharing and the expansion of
I have
transit, I have a car
family.
myself, but I can still sort of see
You ought to pay for
not
it.
as-
It should be expensive to have a car in Vancouver. Any space at all in Vancouver ought to be expensive. And when the city intervenes and makes space that should be expensive cheap, it's a mistake. Oh, by the way, if you were going to upzone, I't one thing that people do have a legitimate concern about is parking. It's going to be less fun to live in your neighborhood if you have to circle the block to park. So I would say grandfather in the incumbents. If you're willing to accept upzoning, you get your freebie parking permit. But anybody who moves in new isn't grandfathered and has to pay a lot of money. Maybe you take the money, give a property tax cut to the incumbents, pay them off.
Right. Rentals vacancies being a big problem around
Yes.
here, and there's a lot of criticism that only only condos get built, and there's not enough rentals coming onto the market, and most of the rental stock is from the 70s or older. Why isn't much of it getting built, and how can that be changed?
Yeah, so I think it has to do with interest rates. That's a pet theory of mine. I worked out the math and I want it to be true, but I think there's an element of truth to it, which is, the tax system favors owner-occupied housing. A landlord pays tax on rental income after expenses, but homeowners don't. And capital gains are exempt for homeowners who own or occupy, but not for landlords. And so the thumb of government is on the scale in favor of home ownership, which might or might not be a good idea. The point I want to make, though, is when inflation is low, homeowners don't get to deduct interest, which usually includes, inflation in it, but landlords do get to deduct interest. And so when interest rates are low, that's a small benefit. When interest rates are high, it's a big benefit. You want to be a landlord relative to a homeowner, more so when interest rates are high, and today interest rates are very low, and they have been for a very long time. So if you went back to the 12% interest rates of the 70s, now the policy environment was different too, but I suspect if rates went to 12%, you'd see a lot more purpose-built rental than you do today.
It'd also be a lot more expensive to take out a mortgage at that point, so there'd be a disincentive for people to be buying new homes.
Well, it would also be a disincentive for anybody to invest in real estate on either side, but the disincentive is reduced by the income tax rate, which is very significant for the kinds of people who invest in real estate. Now, going back to condo bad, rental good, I think there's something to it now, but there's a couple of things that can be done. One, already the empty homes tax, the BC Housing Affordability Fund. Condos, then, if you have housing that's for the local workforce, either it'll be owner-occupied, if somebody can afford it, or somebody's going to want to rent it out to provide rental housing, right? If you can't leave stuff vacant year-round or use it as a vacation home because it's tax disfavored, well, you get a lot more rental housing even out of condos. So I would say, and other people disagree, but I think pushing for purpose-built rental I would call secondary to just getting more units built, A, and B, getting them through tax policy in the hands of the local workforce.
One of the ideas that's been floated is kind of a rental-only zoning system. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, maybe not the end of the world. I think having the provincial government has very cheap money now. So I think having the provincial government maybe build some market rate rental, maybe in partnership with some private people who know what they're doing, wouldn't be crazy at all. And to the extent the province has the ability to hold a gun to municipalities' heads and say, no funding for anything if you don't let us build at greater density than the market, that makes the land much more affordable. So it's not crazy. Not I think as long as you get stuff built and fix tax policy, you don't really need to do it that way. But I don't have a problem with it.
So with the new NDP government coming in today, they got sworn in this morning or this afternoon. They've said with the Greens that they're going to make housing more affordable by increasing supply of affordable housing and taking action to deal with speculation and fraud that's driving up prices, which was literally all they had to say about affordable housing in their sort of alliance agreement. Yeah. I guess that sort of just plays into what you've been talking about, but maybe comment.
Well,
if say they called you up tomorrow and said, Tom, what do we do?
Yeah, so I'd say number one, do the BC Housing Affordability Fund. I think people just don't get how important it is that we really have a very attractive investment environment here because we tax real estate so little and tax working here a lot. So fixing that would obviously help people who work here to afford real estate, like no doubt about it. I think zoning would be great. I think if the province would say, and other places have done that, people are talking about it now in California, you cannot have single-family zoning if you're excluding 95% of the population. Zoning is totally the right of municipalities in the city of Vancouver under the Local Governments Act and Vancouver City Charter. I think that should be amended to say you have to be able to prove that there's a good reason for what you're doing that is good not only for the 20 neighbors who live next door, but for the region as a whole. And you cannot justify single-family at a regional level. So I think doing that on the supply side and fixing tax policy to disfavor people who just have a pied-à-terre or Airbnb or what have you at least lower mainland level, that would be great. I would kill the home partnership loan program, which I think was a really bad idea to encourage people to really lever up. And I think that just adds price. When you don't have enough housing and you give this loan subsidy program to people when they buy a house, you just encourage people to buy a house. I think, just give people money. If you think people don't have enough money, just give them money.
Were there any policies that the NDP or Greens pitched during the election that you think they should sort of back off from?
Going under 30% on the foreign buyer tax, I'll confess, I came here as an American citizen with only a work permit. Now I would not have to pay the foreign buyer tax, but initially I would have. And, with Trump in the White House, when we came up with our proposal, we just had most of us we had some arguments about it, but most of us did not want to do a nationality-based tax. It doesn't sit well with me. And I think it's subject to fraud anyway through corporations or pal on this, cousin, whatever. I think what really matters is, are you using this property to live and work? I think that's an easier to administer and, almost morally better tax. And if you're going to do a foreign buyer tax at 15%, you're collecting a lot of revenue, and that's helpful. I think if you go to 30%, it's equivalent to a ban, because I just can't believe anybody's going to pay a 30% tax on purchase. So you're going to kill the revenue source, and probably people will find a way to get the money in through a corporation or something anyway. I'm not sure about that. I think fraud isn't totally easy, but I'm not in the fraud game and I don't know. So I'd say I'd back off that. Now, they do have some proposals we haven't talked about, flip taxes, etc. I am not convinced flipping is really a major problem here. Or dishonest realtors. I'm sure there is flipping, and I'm sure there are dishonest realtors, but I don't see much in the data to indicate that prices rose 40% in 2016 in some segments because of flipping or fraud. I think it was people who wanted to get money in here, and if they flip, the property's back on the market. I think the problem is when they don't flip. Oh, capital gains taxes, I think, are good, though. Capital gains tax on housing is great. You got to work with the federal government, but any shifting of the tax burden away from labor income into real estate, I think, is great.
Okay, well, tell listeners where they can find you.
So blogs.ubc.ca/Davidoff, if you want to look at any of the work I've done on housing markets generally. And I shouldn't do it, but, sometimes you can find me on Twitter for my latest thoughts on #VanRE, which I think is what I'm supposed to do for Vancouver real estate.
And your Twitter handle is?
Oh, Tom Davidoff.
There you go.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you guys very much for having me.
Thanks. This was fun.
Well, that was a part of our interview with Tom Davidoff earlier this week. If you want to hear the full uncut version, slightly edited to just get some ums out of there, make sure to go to our Patreon page to hear the full thing. But there were also, since then, a couple extra development, housing type stories we thought we'd just briefly touch on. The first being that there's a follow-up to the 105 Kiefer story we touched on a couple weeks ago.
The BD Group has submitted a new proposal to the City Plan Department for approval. This one's 70 feet rather than the 90 feet, the one that was rejected. This one's actually conforms to the current zoning requirements, which has a 70-foot height limit, and it's all market units on this one, which is also consistent with the current zoning. So the previous proposal that got rejected was for a rezoning to add increased density in exchange for some below-market housing get included here. The new proposal documents haven't been uploaded to the city's development website yet, so it's hard to know the exact details, but based off what the media has reported so far, it looks like they're basically just going to be following what they're allowed to build there. And not really sure if this, as far as the opposition to it goes, this is a huge win. There was kind of two prongs on it. One was complaining about the height, and another was the lack of social housing and throwing a bunch of market condos on there there was concerns that would increase gentrification in the area, or I'm not sure, just no social housing and a whole bunch of market condos are going to really ameliorate those concerns. So it seems like maybe not the sort of win the opposition to the project was really hoping for. But at the same time, what else were they expecting to happen to this? And that's why it's always good to consider the counterfactual on any proposal like this before you go out and really fight hard against it.
Meanwhile, City Hall is looking at a couple different changes. First, the city itself here in Vancouver is going to ask developers to pay a bit more to build. When a developer wants to start a new project, they have to pay some fees and also pay into local community assets. the fee portion, it looks like, is going to go up by 25% instead of the sort of 12% it would normally go.
These are the development charge levies, which is basically a charge based on the square footage of new developments to pay for stuff like new infrastructure, the cost of processing the applications and whatnot. And they're done on a per square foot basis, and they're going to be raising to about $15 a square foot for high density buildings and $3.23 for low density. And on one hand, it kind of makes, you want to charge developers to cover some of the costs of the new development. But Vancouver also has the highest development cost levies in the lower mainland here. And at the same time, you really got to wonder about why we're charging low density development less. On a per household basis, it's much more expensive to provide infrastructure, sewers, roads, all of that stuff. So if anything, you think it should be the other way around. And also there's just kind of the question of, if we have housing problems here and housing is unaffordable, is making it more expensive to build housing really going to help?
Interestingly, the city is only applying this to residential development. So they did one economic analysis, and that seemed to suggest this increase won't actually affect the development of residential buildings. I guess they just predict there's so much demand to build in the city of Vancouver that you can just milk these guys for as much money as they have. But you can't do the same for commercial and industrial, so they're not actually changing those rates.
Yeah, and it'll definitely get built, but there's been a lot of complaints that you only get luxury housing built here, and it's all the new stuff's unaffordable. And if you keep kind of squeezing the developers, of course it's all going to be luxury housing, because the non-luxury housing, the margins are too small to really justify all of these additional costs and still actually turn out a housing at the end of this. So I doubt we'll see much of a decrease in housing starts as a result, but that mythical right supply that the city keeps saying it wants to encourage, it's not going to be encouraged by this sort of increase in development fees.
Well, the other proposal coming forward is from the Mayor of Vancouver's office, which I learned today has a website, mayorofvancouver.ca. The city wants to create new incentives for the 12,000 character homes, those that are older than 1940, to densify. So they want more laneway houses, stratified units, the sort of turn a big mansion into 4 mini houses within it, while just sort of keeping the exterior character looking the same so that it's still historic and heritage. We lack a lot of character in our architecture, so there's that always tension there. And their hope is by doing this in the sort of Dunbar, Kerrisdale, Arbutus Ridge areas around here, the wealthy ones, or a bit south of here, I guess, they can get another 4,800 properties, including laneway homes for rentals, increasing the number of homes allowed on a 33-foot lot from 2 to 3, and having more duplexes and fourplexes. This seems like a fairly sensible decision to me, like make it easier to densify some of these neighborhoods, and it's almost in the least controversial way, like let's not tear a bunch of houses down and build up 4 stories, let's turn an 8,000 square foot home into 4 2,000 square foot homes.
This does kind of typify the Vision Vancouver's approach of very, very, very incremental change on some of these areas. But, it's probably not going to get a huge amount of pushback, but at the same time, it's not going to do very much about this. 4,800 properties is nothing. For comparison, there's about 30,000 housing starts this past year in the lower mainland. So this is a very small drop in the bucket. On a per square foot cost, these sorts of laneway houses are actually fairly high. And you still have the really weird land use plan where, okay, you can now have this strata set up with a laneway house, but you wouldn't be allowed the same thing if there was a common wall between the two properties. And it still, I don't think, addresses the fundamental problem in the Vancouver land use, which is we're still leaving 70% of the land for these detached houses. Also, this report just got sent to council to be considered this week, and there isn't even going to be the public hearings until the fall, which Is the city unaware that there's a housing crisis going on? Maybe lead times on months for a very modest densification proposal is taking things way too slow and incremental.
Well, and there's also going to be the by-election this fall, and then the full election next fall. So clock may just run out on time for vision to get any new policies through. And let's close off this episode with quick takes on non-housing stories. First up, there's an interesting article I found in Global News that points out that Trudeau just completely missed the opportunity to trigger our withdrawal from some specific international treaties. And the reason he would want to do this is because he's promised that by July 1st, 2018, we will have legal recreational marijuana in this country. But Canada is a signatory to one or two kind of international treaties that say we are not in favor of that, and we will crack down on the recreational use of marijuana. Well, and those treaties require a 1-year sort of trigger to get us out of. So the Liberals seem to be operating in this weird bubble of maybe we'll just, legalize it and ignore our international obligations. And the hint for that actually comes from the fact they're pointing at some U.S. states that have legalized it despite the U.S. still being party to this treaty. What was good about this Global News article is they spoke to an international law expert who points out that this is not how you're supposed to do international relations because it makes you a hypocrite. And once you're a hypocrite on this, especially when you're a country relatively influential as Canada, a G7 nation, if you're not following your international obligations, people can go, well, why should I follow landmine bans or other things that maybe seem a little bit more consequential than a marijuana prohibition.
Yeah, and this seems particularly strange coming from the Trudeau government, which has placed a lot of emphasis on the sort of multilateral, we're going to be great global citizens sort of thing. This almost seems like a more Harper move in the sort of, we're just going to do a little bit of more like realpolitik kind of approach to international relations where we're going to drive our interests harder and whatnot. But in terms of the Trudeau brand on kind of the international thing, this seems way out of left field and just not where they usually are on these sorts of things. It's really puzzling, and it kind of goes to just the ineffectualness of the Trudeau government in getting a lot of these things done. This shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone in Ottawa, and this has been something they've been thinking about since, August of 2015 when they put it in their platform. So that's nearly 2 years now, and the fact that they didn't consider they needed to pull out of the treaty a year ahead of time really raises some questions.
Well, Steve Hoffman, the expert from York University, did lay out a couple other options that are sort of even less attractive for the Trudeau Liberals. Well, one's what I guess a lot of cynics might expect to happen, which is putting off the legislation or not fully committing through, and then there's no real worry. A second one would be to amend the Constitution, because I guess the treaties do allow it that if you have a constitutional right to cannabis, that you can then go through with it, but the only person interested in opening the Constitution right now is the Quebec government, and if we're going to open it for marijuana legalization, it would be hilarious, and I would love that debate, but it's not going to happen.
It's not the only people who think there should be a constitutional amendment for marijuana is the Marijuana Party, and even they might just actually think it's more a legislative issue. And the way the Canadian Constitution is basically a no-go zone politically, this is just not going to happen.
Well, and then I just love imagining the Supreme Court cases where the right to smoke marijuana comes into conflict with other rights. It seems to happen all the times in Canada. The only other way they could really get around our international obligations is to just say that we're legalizing it for, quote, scientific research, and maybe we're just doing a trial on 36 million people to see what happens when you let them all smoke pot whenever they want.
Yeah, probably just who's the control group on that one.
It doesn't say it has to be a good scientific trial.
That is true. In terms of what's actually going to happen a year from now, My guess is we're either going to end up with a delay, or we're just going to say fuck the international treaties and ignore them like Uruguay has.
The other story I wanted to get in here while we're talking about Trudeau is Spotify released the Trudeau summer playlist. And this has been covered everywhere in the media and Canada Land, and talking about all of the sort of, oh, what songs did he put in there and what does it tell us about Trudeau the person, Trudeau the man, how emotion sensitive is he? Drew Brown has the definitive over-analysis of the summer playlist in Vice, so I'll link that in the show notes. But my question sort of became, because I saw this pop up on the sort of featured playlist of my Spotify, which suggests Spotify was promoting this, and they definitely retweeted the Prime Minister tweeting this, which suggests there's some agreement there. Like, this wasn't just Ian's playlist that accidentally got popular or something, I think. Which is maybe the only way it could work, but I'm almost wondering, like, did money change hands? Which could happen.
It's hard to say. On my Spotify, I didn't actually see it. I had to go digging for it after I saw the news story. So, it might be one of those things where, for some reason, Spotify thinks you like the Prime Minister's music more than I do.
When I like a whole bunch of punk rock and indie music, it's suddenly like, hey, check out this Trudeau pop.
Or the other thing is, it's the Prime Minister. It got popular because he popularized it and the algorithm kicked it out. I don't actually know kind of the Spotify algorithm well enough to weigh in on it.
The one just question that looms in my mind that's like the worst case scenario is, could this count as a donation from Spotify to the Liberal Party of Canada, sort of a featured advertisement, in which case it would arguably violate our campaign finance rules, which say companies can't give donations or in-kind donations to political parties, at least at the federal level. It's very trivial,
yeah.
But I haven't seen anyone ask it or look into it, and so I just want to put it out there.
Would be interesting.
Better journalists than I should do access to, and I'm not a journalist, should do access to information requests.
Yeah, the other thing about this, though, is I'm not sure it's a great look to be playing DJ when one of the major provinces has declared a state of emergency and there are thousands of Canadians displaced from their homes. It's just kind of doesn't have a good, I'm paying attention to the country I'm supposed to be governing look to it. On the bright side, at least he didn't have anything like we didn't start the fire or cities on flame with rock. Well, like, he avoided all the fire signs, so minor win there, even if the larger image isn't great.
The federal government forgetting about British Columbia is not news.
But one thing of importance that's going to be happening this summer is the NAFTA negotiations are expected to start up in August, and the Trump administration this week put out their goals for what they want to get out of the NAFTA renegotiation. So there's some of them like they want to change the dispute resolution methods in NAFTA and appeal only to the WTO. They want to exempt state and local governments from having to open up contracts to Canadian Mexican firms. But at the same time, they kind of want to access to our local procurement. So that's going to definitely be a touchy thing. And some of the actual probably good things for Canada here is they want to raise the de minimis border allowances from the ridiculously low, was it like $20 for Canada right now?
They'll look at anything that's worth over $20.
Yes. They want to raise that up to $800, which, about time. It's $20 is ridiculously low. And they also want to open up the telecoms market to competition, which good, because uncompetitive Canadian telecoms market is one of the big reasons we have some of the most expensive internet and cell phone service in the world. So overall, kind of mixed bag as far as Canada's concerned.
Yeah, it seems like the major point of contention is this tweaking or just straight up elimination of the dispute resolution panels. This, I guess, has been described as sort of Canada's red line, because when we have trade disputes over things like softwood lumber that we have right now, it's these panels that we try to use to come to a mutual agreement rather than having to sort of go to international bodies that either or both countries might actually just ignore. So, while this is well outside my expertise or knowledge, this seems like it's going to be a hot topic. The rest of it sounded like it's not too controversial, but again, the devil might be in the details, and we'll have to see. It was actually interesting to see that the supply management, which is always the beef of, pun intended, Americans and other markets, wasn't actually mentioned in this outline. So there's some of the typical rhetoric, but none of around challenging domestic protectionism, which supply management is, but no sort of, it must be taken down. So the Americans might be kind of content to just give up on supply management for now, let us have it, and maybe go after other things like these dispute resolution panels.
Which no doubt will disappoint Maxime Bernier. It's worth noting here that the dispute resolution panel they're talking about is the Chapter 19 one, which is about duties and countervailing duties, and not the Chapter 11 investor-state dispute one, which is what a lot of people have criticized around NAFTA. So this is the one they're proposing getting rid of is the least controversial of the dispute resolution. So far, Canada hasn't put out our list of goals for the renegotiation of NAFTA, so we're going to have to keep an eye out for that. It's going to be interesting to see what the Trudeau government sees as kind of the big things to go after. I expect Buy American will be featured prominently, as well as softwood lumber. And finally, we're going to head down under, where Australia has been rocked by a political scandal when it was revealed a senator from Queensland was secretly Canadian.
Larissa Waters is a Green Party member, and apparently in 1977 she was born in Winnipeg, where her parents were studying. I guess they were going to Winnipeg. Her family moved back to Australia when she was young, and basically she's spent her entire life there since, and she hasn't been back to Canada since she was 11 months old. And she sort of thought she had to actively seek Canadian citizenship, but no, we're one of those countries that just gives it to you for being born here. So she's a dual citizen. Australia has this weird constitutional provision that says you cannot be a citizen of a foreign power and be elected to Parliament. So she was forced to resign. And interestingly, she's one of the was one of the co-deputy leaders of the Australian Greens. One of the other co-deputy leaders, Scott Ludlam, also discovered he had New Zealand citizenship. So the Green Party in Australia is just bleeding dual citizens out of its caucus, I guess. What was weird about this story in the CBC is, for whatever reason, the only other thing they could find out about Waters was she posted a photo at some point of her on Twitter breastfeeding in Senate there, being the first woman to breastfeed in the Australian Parliament. And they decided to run that as the banner image for this, because I guess
a separate one later, or further down, too.
Just from her tweet, but yeah. I guess it was the only image they could find of her. It seems like it was just a sort of curiosity, but odd that Australia, whose constitution dates to 1901 today...
Which is older than ours in some respects.
Yeah, Australia is more of a real country than Canada is so anti... Well, I guess it doesn't surprise me that much that Australia is anti-foreigner, but...
Well, I think it's also maybe our Canadian bias coming in here where we don't have that requirement, but a lot of places do. Perhaps most notably the U.S. as far as... Where it's not even... You can't be a dual citizenship. You can't even be born outside of the country if you want to be president.
Well, I know it was almost a mini scandal during the 2015 election when people started talking about Thomas Mulcair's dual citizenship with France. And he said, well, if I really had to, I'd renounce it. But no one really seemed to care outside of people who really always would hate the NDP.
Or the French. But yeah, as far as career-ending political scandals go, this is probably the mildest they've ever come.
Especially for Australia, where they've knifed multiple leaders in the back of different parties, because it's how they changed leaders there.
But yeah, props on Australia for finding a scandal even less consequential than touch in the Queen's elbow. And that has been Politos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access and our full interviews at patreon.com/Politos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.